Talon Merik was the kind of roommate no one noticed, quiet, clean, and barely present. Nolen Vesk, on the other hand, was full of life, always smiling, always talking, and completely unaware that the man sleeping just a few feet away had been watching him with growing hatred. What began as silent tension between two strangers living under the same roof would soon unravel into one of the most horrifying crimes the city had ever seen. One that ended with a hacksaw, a blood-soaked bedroom, and a witness walking in at eye. The worst possible moment. Talon Merik moved into the third-floor apartment on a rainy afternoon in early March. The listing had been simple: 3 bedrooms, 1 shared bath, a small kitchen, and cheap rent. It didn't matter to Talon what the place looked like. He wasn't looking for luxury, just quiet. He didn't talk much during the initial walkthrough. He simply nodded when Nolen Vesk, the first tenant, introduced himself and kept his responses brief. The third roommate, Brayth Drale, was at work that day and wouldn't meet Talon until later in the week. Within days, Talon settled into the room at the far end of the hallway, a dark corner space that barely got any sunlight. He brought with him only a twin bed, an old laptop, and a single duffel bag. Life in the apartment took on a predictable rhythm. Brayth worked overnight shifts and often came home while the sun was still rising. He'd collapse into bed and sleep until afternoon. Nolen, more extroverted, worked part-time at a tech store and often spent his evenings either gaming or inviting friends over. Talon stayed in his room most of the time. His door was always closed. Occasionally, he'd come out for a glass of water or to microwave food, but he rarely stayed in the common areas. He made little eye contact, barely spoke unless spoken to, and kept to himself with almost clinical precision. In the beginning, Nolen found Talon's behavior odd, but not threatening. He even joked once to Brayth that Talon might be some kind of hacker or ghostwriter, someone who thrived in darkness and silence. Brayth shrugged it off. Everyone had quirks, and Talon paid his rent on time. That was good enough. But as weeks passed, the roommates began noticing strange habits. Talon never turned on lights, even after sunset. Sometimes Brayth would wake in the middle of the night to find Talon standing motionless in the kitchen, staring out the window, not moving for minutes. Once, Nolen walked into the bathroom and found the sink filled with red-tinted water. Talon brushed it off as cleaning solution, though he hadn't been seen with any. Still, nobody thought much of it. People were weird, and weird didn't mean dangerous. But subtle tensions began to grow. Nolen, being naturally social, started feeling watched. He'd catch glimpses of Talon peering out of his cracked bedroom door when he had guests over. One of his friends said they felt uneasy, like someone was listening from the hallway. Talon's name would come up in hushed conversations, often followed by the words creepy or strange. Brayth, meanwhile, noticed that items in the fridge would disappear and then reappear in different places. Once, his laundry, carefully folded and placed on his bed, had clearly been touched. Shirts were inside out, and his socks were missing. There was no real confrontation. Nobody wanted to create drama. Talon was always polite, always calm. His eyes, however, were cold, emotionless, in a way that made people uncomfortable. He had no social media, no visitors, and no phone calls. Sometimes it seemed like he didn't even sleep. The only sounds from his room were faint tapping on his keyboard and occasional dragging noises across the floor, like he was rearranging furniture in the middle of the night. When neighbors saw Talon in the stairwell or outside, they barely recognized him. He never responded to greetings. He walked with a stiff posture, his gaze always low, as if avoiding the world entirely. Nolen joked once to Brayth that Talon might be writing a manifesto. They both laughed, but only briefly. There was something deeply unsettling about living with someone so emotionally vacant, so completely withdrawn. And yet, life continued. Rent was paid, trash was taken out. The days blurred into each other. No one asked questions. No one checked on anyone else. It was a quiet apartment, almost too quiet. The kind of place where the silence grew thick, pressing into the walls like a secret waiting to explode. It was a gray, overcast Sunday evening when Brayth Drale came home from his shift at the packaging warehouse. The streets were slick from a light drizzle, and the sky was the same dull color as the concrete sidewalks. He trudged up the stairs of the apartment building, exhausted and craving sleep. Normally, he wouldn't be home this early. His supervisor had let him go a few hours ahead of schedule due to a mechanical issue at work. He welcomed the unexpected break and looked forward to a quiet evening. As he pushed open the apartment door, something immediately felt wrong. There was a strange stillness in the air, not just the usual silence, but a heavy, unnatural quiet that made his skin prickle. The apartment was dim, lit only by the natural gray light coming through the living room window. He set down his bag and called out softly, expecting to hear Nolen's voice or see Talon's door shut tight like usual. But there was no answer. Just silence. Then came the smell. Metallic, thick, unmistakable. Brayth had worked around machines long enough to recognize the scent of blood. At first he tried to rationalize it. Maybe something had spilled. Maybe someone had cut themselves. But as he walked slowly down the hallway toward the bedrooms, his chest tightened. The smell grew stronger with each step. Nolen's door was ajar, and the light inside flickered erratically, as though the bulb was dying. Brayth hesitated for a second before pushing the door open the rest of the way. What he saw made his body freeze in place. His legs locked, his breath caught, and a soundless scream seemed to rise and die inside his throat. Talon Merik was kneeling on the floor in the middle of the room. His clothes were soaked in dark red. In his hands, he held a hacksaw, its blade halfway embedded into the neck of a lifeless, bloodied body. Nolen Vesk lay face up, eyes wide open in a frozen stare, mouth slightly agape. His hands were limp by his sides, and his throat had been nearly severed. Blood had pooled beneath him, soaking the carpet and spreading toward the walls. Some of it had splattered onto the dresser and nearby mirror. Talon didn't look up. He continued sawing with slow, steady motions, as if he were working on a piece of wood rather than a human body. There was no urgency in his movements, no panic. His face was expressionless, calm, like he was completing a routine chore. The sound of the blade scraping through bone echoed faintly in the room, mixing with Brayth's rapid heartbeat. Brayth's mind struggled to make sense of the scene. For a few seconds, he couldn't move. Then, survival instincts took over. He turned and ran out of the room, nearly tripping over his own feet. His hands trembled as he pulled out his phone, barely managing to punch in the numbers. When the dispatcher picked up, he could hardly form the words, only muttering phrases like, "murder, blood, and my roommate." Police arrived within minutes. The building was sealed off. Officers stormed the apartment with weapons drawn, expecting resistance. But Talon didn't fight. He dropped the hacksaw when ordered, stood up, and allowed himself to be handcuffed. His face remained blank, devoid of emotion or recognition. He didn't speak a word as he was led out of the apartment and into the waiting patrol car. Inside, Nolen's body remained exactly as Brayth had found it, surrounded by a crime scene so gruesome that seasoned detectives turned away in disbelief. The quiet apartment that had once seemed peaceful had become the site of a nightmare. Neighbors gathered in the hallway, whispering and speculating as flashing red and blue lights lit up the building. Brayth sat in a corner of the hallway, wrapped in a blanket, still shaking. He couldn't unsee what he had walked in on. The image of Talon, kneeling with the saw, his roommate's neck half gone, would be burned into his mind forever. And he couldn't understand one thing: why Talon had done it. There had been no arguments, no fights, no warning signs big enough to predict something like this. But the answer, if there was one, would soon begin to unfold in chilling detail. After Talon Merik was taken into custody, detectives from the Portland Police Department began the meticulous process of examining the crime scene. Every surface of Nolen's bedroom was photographed and sampled. The blood spatter on the walls suggested a prolonged and violent attack. The hacksaw Talon had used was collected, its blade still caked with tissue and hair. Yet despite the brutality of the act, investigators were struck by how methodically everything had been carried out. There were no signs of struggle, no overturned furniture, and nothing broken. It didn't feel like a spontaneous act of rage. It felt planned. The search of Talon's bedroom revealed even more disturbing details. His room, always dark and sparsely furnished, contained very little at first glance. Just a bed, a small desk, and a filing cabinet. But beneath the mattress, detectives found something chilling: a thick, leather-bound journal with a cracked spine and yellowed pages. The cover was unmarked. Inside, the handwriting was sharp, precise, and deeply unsettling. The journal read like the thoughts of someone slowly unraveling. The first few entries were vague, written months before the murder. Talon described feeling suffocated by noise and drowning in presence. While the entries didn't name anyone at first, it became clear they were directed at Nolen. He wrote that Nolen's laugh pierced his skull, that his footsteps felt like thunder, that every time Nolen entered a room, Talon ceased to exist. As the journal progressed, the tone shifted. The entries became darker, more detailed. Talon wrote about how he began following Nolen's routines, studying his habits. There were pages that listed the exact times Nolen left for work, returned, home, and even what he ate. One page included a hand-drawn map of the apartment, with X's marked over Nolen's bedroom and the hallway. Another page listed potential weapons: kitchen knives, utility blades, a crowbar, and finally, a hacksaw. That item had been underlined multiple times. In one particularly haunting entry dated just 5 days before the murder, Talon wrote, "When he's gone, the air will be mine again." He described a fantasy where the apartment would return to silence, where his heart wouldn't race every time Nolen laughed or played music. But most disturbing of all was the final entry. Written the night before the murder, it read only, "Tomorrow, I reclaim the space. No more echoes." Investigators continued their search and found several folders on Talon's laptop, password protected but ultimately accessible. The contents included bookmarked articles about serial killers, crime scene, cleanups in human anatomy. There were search histories detailing how long it takes to bleed out from a neck wound and how to dispose of a body without leaving evidence. It was undeniable. Talon had been planning Nolen's murder for weeks, if not months. Forensic psychologists, brought in to analyze the materials, described the writings as a mixture of obsession, resentment, and delusion. Talon hadn't just disliked Nolen, he had fixated on him, internalizing every small annoyance until it festered into hatred. His journal painted the picture of someone who viewed his victim not as a person, but as an obstacle to his own comfort. There were no signs of remorse, no hesitation in his words. The police now understood that this wasn't an impulsive act. It wasn't about revenge or self-defense. It was about control. Talon felt powerless in the presence of others, and in his distorted mind, the only way to reclaim power was through violence. He had executed his plan with cold precision, and the journal was the roadmap. Detectives boxed the journal carefully, knowing it would become the centerpiece of the prosecution's case. It was more than just evidence. It was a confession in ink, a window into a disturbed and dangerous mind. The question now wasn't whether Talon was guilty, that was clear. The real question was, how long had he been hiding this darkness, and how had no one seen it until it was too late? Talon Merik's trial began just 4 months after his arrest. The case had drawn widespread media attention due to the shocking nature of the crime. The courtroom was filled each day. Journalists with notepads, neighbors from the apartment building, and students from the local college where Nolen Vesk had once studied computer science. The atmosphere was thick with curiosity and dread, but Talon remained emotionless through it all, sitting still at the defendant's table, never flinching as his crime was dissected in front of strangers. The prosecution built its case on overwhelming physical evidence: the blood-covered hacksaw, the forensic data from Talon's room, the journal with his own handwriting, and the laptop full of incriminating searches. Witnesses took the stand one by one. The medical examiner described the brutal nature of Nolen's injuries in cold, clinical detail. A digital forensics expert walked the jury through Talon's disturbing search history. Brayth Drale, the roommate who had discovered the murder, gave a trembling account of what he had seen that day, his voice cracking as he described the lifeless body and Talon's expressionless face. The defense did not dispute that Talon had killed Nolen. Their strategy was different. They claimed Talon suffered from an undiagnosed mental illness, possibly a severe form of paranoid schizophrenia or psychotic depression. A court-appointed psychiatrist had evaluated Talon and testified that while he was intelligent and aware of his surroundings, he showed signs of delusional thinking and extreme emotional detachment. According to the psychiatrist, Talon believed that Nolen's mere presence was a threat to his psychological survival, and over time, this belief turned deadly. But the prosecution argued that Talon had shown a high level of planning and self-control, undermining the insanity defense. They pointed to the precise timeline in his journal, his calm demeanor during the arrest, and the fact that he had taken steps to hide his intentions for weeks. Talon knew what he was doing, they said. He chose his moment, prepared his tools, and waited until he was sure Nolen would be alone. Throughout the trial, Talon never spoke. He declined to testify. He showed no visible emotion when the jury was presented with photographs of the crime scene. His lack of response unsettled the courtroom. Even when his own attorney spoke about his potential mental illness, Talon simply stared forward, his eyes distant and unreadable. The turning point came when the prosecution read the final entry of Talon's journal aloud in court. "Tomorrow, I reclaim the space. No more echoes." The words rang out in the hushed courtroom like a verdict in themselves. Those 7 words summed up the cold deliberation behind the act. There was no remorse, no hesitation, only purpose. After 8 days of testimony and evidence, the jury deliberated for less than 5 hours. Talon Merik was found guilty of first-degree murder. The judge, a stern and experienced man who had presided over many violent cases, called it one of the most chillingly calculated murders he had ever encountered. He sentenced Talon to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The courtroom remained silent as the verdict was read. Brayth Drale, sitting in the gallery, exhaled deeply, as if holding in breath since that horrific night. The weight of finality had settled in. There would be no more questions, no more court dates. Talon was going away forever. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed to deliver breaking news updates. Some focused on the brutality of the murder, others on the eerie personality of Talon Merik. Experts appeared on talk shows analyzing his mental state, debating whether he was a monster or a broken mind. But no theory could undo what had been done. Nolen Vesk was dead. A young man with a promising future had been butchered in his own bedroom, and the person responsible had shared his roof. Behind bars, Talon remained silent. He refused interviews. He spent his days in solitary confinement, reading books in the prison library, and staring at the same blank wall each night. For the rest of the world, the case was over. But for those who had lived it, the horror lingered. A year had passed since the horrific murder of Nolen Vesk, but the scars it left behind had only begun to settle. For Brayth Drale, life never returned to normal. He moved out of the apartment just days after the crime, unable to sleep under the same roof where his roommate's blood had stained the carpets. Even though the walls were scrubbed clean and the furniture replaced, The memory clung to the space like a fog that refused to lift. He developed insomnia and a sharp sensitivity to sound. Any creak of floorboards or hum of machinery reminded him of that terrible moment when he walked in and saw Talon hunched over Nolen's body. Brayth had started therapy but found it difficult to articulate what he'd witnessed. He would stare at the floor in long silences, shaking his head whenever the memory surfaced. People treated him differently now. Co-workers stepped lightly around him, neighbors offered sympathetic looks, and even friends struggled to find the right words. He hated the pity in their eyes, but more than anything, he hated the fact that he still didn't understand why it had happened. Talon Merik hadn't just taken Nolen's life. He had shattered every sense of security Brayth once had. Nolen's family had held a quiet memorial service months earlier, far from the city where the tragedy took place. His parents, Joran and Lyra Vesk, withdrew from the public eye, avoiding interviews and news coverage. They released only one statement to the press. "Our son was a light in every room. He did not deserve the darkness that found him." Their grief became a private thing, too deep for public consumption. They set up a scholarship fund in Nolen's name at his former university, hoping his legacy might carry forward in a small way, even if his future had been stolen. Meanwhile, Talon Merik became a symbol for something no one could quite agree on. Some called him evil, a cold-blooded killer who had plotted a silent execution under the noses of everyone around him. Others speculated about mental illness and the invisible walls that may have closed in on him long before the crime. But Talon himself offered no clarity. He refused all interview requests, denied visits from journalists and psychologists, and kept to himself inside the walls of Black Ridge Penitentiary, a high-security facility known for housing some of the most dangerous criminals in the state. He was kept under observation in a single-occupancy cell, monitored through surveillance 24/7. Prison guards described him as quiet, polite, and eerily detached. He followed instructions, never caused trouble, and never spoke unless spoken to. He read constantly, mostly philosophy, criminal law, and obscure historical texts. There were rumors that he wrote in a new journal, but if it existed, no one had seen it. His behavior was calm, but there was something about his presence that unsettled even the most seasoned prison staff. It was the way he seemed completely unaffected, as if he existed in a world far removed from guilt or consequence. One guard described Talon as a man who doesn't see the world the way we do. Another said that looking into his eyes was like staring into an empty room, quiet, organized, and hollow. The media eventually moved on. New tragedies, new headlines, new stories took their place in the public eye. But the people who had touched this story, the ones who lived in that building, who went to school with Nolen, who worked with Talon, didn't forget. Some changed apartments, others installed extra locks. A few stopped living with roommates altogether. The case left behind a quiet ripple of fear that reminded everyone how easily horror could walk unnoticed among them. In the end, Talon Merik never explained why he did it. No confession, no apology, no moment of reflection. Just silence. A silence that Brayth would remember forever. A silence that Nolen's parents would carry for the rest of their lives. And a silence that made one thing terrifyingly clear. The most dangerous monsters are the ones who hide behind stillness and wait.